The Civil Rights Movement. In this video, we will take a look at the civil rights movement, the civic mobilization, and social activism of African Americans, and the first steps towards desegregation. The roots of the civil rights movement. After the Civil War, Reconstruction had failed to secure basic rights for African Americans. Up until the first half of the 20th century, African Americans in the South still faced systematic racism under the Jim Crow laws and lack of opportunities for economic advancement, as many were trapped in sharecropping and tenant farming. During the Great Migration, African Americans moved to the north, trying to escape these conditions, but often still faced racial discrimination in housing and the workplace. Acts of racial violence, like lynchings and riots, were also common throughout the country. African American churches and organizations like the NAACP, which sought to advance civil rights for Black Americans, and the National Urban League, which originally focused on increasing job opportunities, organized and mobilized African Americans and their communities around the country. Howard University also played an important role in the movement, training African American leaders and lawyers to legally overturn segregation in federal courts. The independence movements in Africa and Asia greatly influenced the movement. Mahatma Gandhi's use of nonviolent methods of resistance in the struggle for Indian independence greatly influenced leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and James Farmer. Farmer and other African American leaders formed the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, which precisely emphasized the use of nonviolent means of protest to fight segregation and racism. The African nations had also started independence movements, creating in African Americans a sense of common identity and solidarity. During World War II, African Americans had served in segregated units overseas, encountering less racism in Europe than at home. Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802 had eliminated discrimination based on race, color, or creed from federal government and contractor jobs. These developments encouraged African Americans to fight to expand their rights and make America a more pluralistic, democratic society. As the Cold War intensified, racism and segregation were tarnishing America's image as the leader of the free world, and political leaders became sensitive to this issue. Truman took some early steps by desegregating the armed forces and enforcing the end of discrimination in hiring by the federal government. Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, 1954. As you can recall, the Supreme Court had ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that state segregation laws were constitutional, as long as separate but equal facilities were provided. Black lawyers from the NAACP began challenging the separate but equal doctrine in public education as early as the 1930s. In the early 1950s, Linda Brown, a schoolgirl in Topeka, Kansas, was forced to attend an all-black school, even though she lived much closer to a white school. Her father sued the school board over the issue, and in 1953, the NAACP appealed her case, along with several other similar cases, to the U.S. Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall, the lawyer handling the case, did not argue that the facilities given to African American children were inferior, but instead argued that segregation sends the psychological message of inferiority to black children, since they are not considered good enough to attend a white school. It was a unanimous decision, and Justice Earl Warren announced that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. As a reaction to this landmark decision, Southern senators in Congress signed a public protest against the decision, while local officials swore that they would never enforce it. Anti-black violence increased in the South, along with the membership of the Ku Klux Klan. In 1955, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old from Chicago who was visiting his aunt in Mississippi, was murdered after whistling at a young white woman in a shop. The murder created a wave of shock, especially after the suspects were acquitted by an all-white Southern jury, despite ample evidence against them. Southern resistance to integration required the Supreme Court to make a separate ruling to implement the Brown decision. Enforcement was handed to lower federal courts, and it was asked that school districts complied with desegregation with all deliberate speed. Despite this, desegregation would take many years, as many Southern public schools closed their doors rather than integrate. In some cases, the courts resorted to busing or requiring districts to send students in school buses to more distant schools in order to accomplish integration. The Montgomery Bus Boycott. In the South, segregation was also present in public transportation. On public buses, African Americans were forced to sit in the back, while the front section was reserved for whites. One evening, in December 1955, Rosa Parks was riding home on a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama. The driver asked Parks to give up her seat since there was no room left in the white section, and she promptly refused. Rosa Parks, who was an active NAACP member, was arrested later that evening. NAACP leaders organized a boycott of Montgomery city buses to protest her arrest. They demanded courteous treatment of African Americans, an end to segregation on the city buses, and the hiring of African American bus drivers. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a young Baptist minister, emerged as the natural leader of the boycott movement. Dr. King believed in nonviolence and passive resistance to change the attitude of the oppressors. The organizers arranged carpools and cabs to take boycotters to work. Many others walked, while city buses sat idle. Rosa Parks and other bus riders sued, and a federal court ruled in their favor. City buses were integrated. The determination of African Americans to end segregation had paid off. Dr. King, Ralph Abernathy, and other African American ministers formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, to fight for racial equality by using nonviolent means. Little Rock, Arkansas, 1957. In 1957, the school board of Little Rock, Arkansas, admitted 9 black children to its all-white high school. The governor of Arkansas opposed the decision and sent in the state's National Guard to prevent the children from entering the school. After pressure from President Eisenhower, the governor finally removed the guard and allowed the children to attend school, failing, however, to take the adequate measures to protect them. On their first day of school, the 9 students, known as the Little Rock Nine, were threatened by an angry white mob. Eisenhower sent federal troops to Little Rock and ordered the Arkansas National Guard to defend the students. The troops surrounded the high school, and the 9 students were given military escorts for the rest of the school year. Social activism. African American organizations used social activism, or actions promoting social and political change, to push for racial equality. In 1960, a group of African American students sat at a white-only lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. These students simply refused to get up, even as they were surrounded and assaulted by an angry crowd. Soon, this tactic, known as a sit-in, was copied by other students throughout the South. Sit-ins were staged at other lunch counters, libraries, swimming pools, parks, and other public places and facilities. The students involved were often beaten or arrested. In 1960, many of these students gathered in North Carolina and formed a new civil rights organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. Freedom Rides. The Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, organized the first Freedom Ride in 1961. In Freedom Rides, black students rode together with white students in desegregated buses throughout several states in the South, often facing violence from angry mobs or arrests by hostile local police forces. Organizers hoped to provoke a crisis so that the federal government was forced to intervene. Freedom Riders risked injury and even death. They continued the rides and eventually received protection from federal marshals. Letter from Birmingham Jail, 1963. In the spring of 1963, Dr. King led a march into Birmingham, the largest city in Alabama. He was immediately arrested and put in solitary confinement. While a prisoner, Dr. King wrote his famous letter from Birmingham Jail, explaining why after 340 years, African Americans could no longer delay their fight for equal rights. As more protesters were arrested, the jails in Birmingham were completely full. Television reporters covered the arrests and the brutal tactics used by Birmingham police against peaceful protesters, including the use of fire hoses and police dogs. Eventually, stores in downtown Birmingham agreed to desegregate their lunch counters and to hire African American employees. Some residents objected to these concessions, and even a Ku Klux Klan rally was held in the city. Dr. King's home was bombed, and riots broke out, forcing President Kennedy to bring in federal troops to restore order. The March on Washington. In 1963, President Kennedy proposed a new civil rights bill that unfortunately did not get support in Congress. A. Philip Randolph, Dr. King, Bayard Rustin, and other civil rights leaders organized a march on Washington in support of Kennedy's civil rights bill. More than 250,000 people gathered along the reflecting pool in front of the Lincoln Memorial. There, Dr. King delivered his famous speech, "I Have a Dream," in which he shared his vision of a future in which people of all races and backgrounds would live together peacefully as brothers and sisters. This was the height of the civil rights movement, and the echo of those words pronounced on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial still resounds today. In the next video, we will look at the consequences of the civil rights movement. the Nation of Islam, and the Black Power movement. Thank you for watching. Please click like and subscribe for more videos.